The divorce papers were in the third drawer of my desk. Not filed, not signed. Drafted and reviewed and revised and sitting in a manila envelope with my attorney's name in the return address corner, waiting for the decision that I had been 4 days away from making for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of being 4 days away. Which meant I had not made the decision, and I had not unmade it either. I had simply been living in the specific, suspended territory of a person who knows what the next step is, and cannot yet bring himself to take it. Not because he does not believe the step is right, but because taking it means the thing he is stepping away from is finished. And finished is a different category than difficult. And he has been in difficult for so long that finished feels like a language he has not yet learned to speak. The papers were in the drawer. The drawer was in the study. The study was on the second floor of a house in Franklin, Tennessee, that Miriam and I had moved into 9 years ago, when we were still the kind of people who chose houses together, walking through rooms and standing in light and trying to imagine the life that would happen in a particular kitchen or beside a particular window. The future as a room you could almost see yourself inside. I was sitting in the study on a Thursday evening in November. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when they contain two people who have stopped talking to each other, not with hostility, but with the specific, exhausted silence of two people who have said everything available to them and have discovered that saying more of it produces nothing new. We had been in that silence for 4 months. Before the silence was a year of conversations that went nowhere. Before the conversations were 2 years of distance that neither of us formally acknowledged. Before the distance was a marriage that had been real and good and organized around the kind of genuine partnership that makes people believe, when they are inside it, that the partnership is the permanent condition rather than the current one. I was ready to file. I had told my attorney, a woman named Constance Webb who practiced family law in Nashville and who had the specific, professional calm of a person who has sat across from people at the worst moments of their lives so many times that the worst no longer surprises her, that I would call her by the end of the week. It was Thursday. The end of the week was 2 days away. I was sitting in the study not reading the book that was open in front of me and thinking about whether I could be the person who made the call and signed the papers and walked away from 14 years of a marriage that had, for most of its duration, been the best thing in my life. I heard Miriam on the phone. She was in the bedroom. The bedroom and the study shared a wall. A thin wall, the kind that was built when walls were built to divide space rather than to contain sound, and through which, in the 9 years we had lived in this house, I had heard everything from laughter to arguing, to the specific, gentle sounds of a marriage conducting itself in private. I had not been eavesdropping. I want to say that clearly because it matters. I was not listening for anything. I was sitting with a book I was not reading and a decision I had not yet made, and the sound of my wife's voice came through the wall, the way sounds come through thin walls, without permission and without invitation, simply because the physics of it did not require either. She was crying, not loudly, the specific contained crying of a person who has been trying very hard not to cry, and has lost the effort in a moment when they believed they were alone. The kind of crying that happens when the performance of composure has finally exceeded the capacity to sustain it. I heard her say, "I do not know how much longer I can do this without telling him." A pause. She said, "I know. I know what you said. But he is right there. He is in the next room and he does not know, and every day I do not tell him I am taking something from him that he deserves to have." Another pause. Longer. She said, "I am not protecting him. I am protecting myself. And I know that. I know the difference." She was quiet for a moment and I could hear, in the quality of the quiet, that the person on the other end of the call was speaking. Someone close to her. The specific intimacy of the call suggested someone she trusted completely, the kind of trust that allows the worst things to be said without management. Then she said, "If he finds out from someone else, I will never forgive myself. And he will never forgive me either. And we will have lost the marriage over a secret that I kept because I was afraid when I should have been brave." She said, "I need more time." A pause. She said, "Just a little more time." Then she said, "I love you. Thank you for listening." The call ended. I heard her move in the bedroom, I heard her go to the bathroom, I heard the water run. I sat in the study with the book open and the third drawer closed and the manila envelope inside it, and the sentence playing in a loop through everything I thought I knew and everything I had been preparing to do. He does not know, and every day I do not tell him I am taking something from him that he deserves to have. I am not protecting him. I am protecting myself. My name is Daniel Croft. I am 46 years old. I was born in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, the only child of a woman named Frances, who worked as a nurse practitioner, and a man named Gerald, who taught high school history, and who had the specific, patient relationship with the past that comes from spending your professional life explaining to young people why the things that happened before they were born are the reason the things happening now are happening. My father believed that the most important thing he could teach his students was not the events themselves but the connections between them, the invisible threads that run through human experience and that make the past not a collection of facts, but a living argument about what human beings do when they are under pressure and what they are capable of when they are not. I inherited this from him. The attention to the threads, the habit of looking not at the event but at what produced the event and what the event was producing in turn. I had been looking at the events of the past 4 months and I had concluded that the thread running through them was distance. Miriam pulling away. Miriam spending more evenings in the bedroom. Miriam taking calls in other rooms. Miriam being present in the house without being present in the marriage, which is the specific devastating kind of absence that is worse than the geographic kind because it is ambiguous, and ambiguity is harder to address than fact. I had attributed the distance to the marriage itself, to the accumulated weight of 14 years and the gradual unannounced relocation of the center of gravity between us, to the things we had stopped saying, and the things we had never said, and the space that had grown in the place where saying should have been. I had been wrong about the thread, or not wrong. Incomplete. The distance was not caused by the marriage failing. The distance was caused by a secret. And the secret, whatever it was something she believed she should tell me and had not told me, and that she was, in her own words, protecting herself by not telling. I sat in the study for a long time after the call ended. I did not move toward the bedroom. I did not knock on the door. I did not walk in and say, "I heard you on the phone and I need to know what you are carrying." I sat. I breathed. I thought about my father and the threads and the connections between things and the difference between what an event looks like on the surface and what it is producing underneath. Then I made a decision. Not about the papers, about the waiting. I would wait. I would not call Constance at the end of the week. I would wait for Miriam to tell me what she needed to tell me, because she had said she needed more time and because the thing she was carrying was hers to carry until she was ready to set it down, and I was not going to force her to set it down before she was ready. I would wait. I did not know that waiting was the decision that would change everything. Let me tell you about Miriam. Miriam Croft was 44 years old and had been a pediatric occupational therapist for 16 years. She worked at a children's rehabilitation center in Brentwood 3 days a week, with children whose developmental challenges required the specific, patient, inventive attention of a person who could make therapeutic work feel like play without ever losing sight of the work inside the play. She was extraordinary at this, not because she had been trained to be extraordinary, though she had been thoroughly trained, but because she had a specific gift for seeing what a child needed that came from somewhere below training, from the same place that genuine gifts always come from, which is a combination of nature and the specific experiences that nature has been shaped by over a lifetime. I knew about one of those experiences. I had always known about it, in the way that spouses know the important things about each other, present and integrated into the understanding of the person, rather than sitting separately as a fact. What I did not know was how active that experience still was, how present in her daily life, how much of the distance of the past 4 months had been organized around it. Miriam had lost a baby before we met. When she was 27 and in a relationship with a man named Robert who had left when the loss happened, which is the specific, additional cruelty that some losses carry, the departure of the person who was supposed to stay. She had told me about it on our 4th date, in a restaurant in Nashville with the careful, matter-of-fact honesty of a person who has decided that the information is relevant and that the relevant things should be said early so that the person receiving them can make an informed decision about what they are entering. I had received the information the way she offered it, as relevant and important and as a part of her that I was choosing to be in relationship with. It was not separate from her. It was part of the specific layered person I was falling in love with. We had tried to have children for 3 years after we married. The trying had not produced a child, and the not producing had produced a grief that we had navigated together, and that had changed both of us, and that had left us ultimately in a marriage that was built not on the family we had planned, but on the family we were, which was two people who had chosen each other, and who had discovered that the choosing was sufficient even when the other things were not. This was true. I believed it completely. What I did not know was that the grief had not finished its work, that it was still working underneath the surface, in ways that Miriam had been carrying for months, and that had produced the distance I had been interpreting as the marriage ending when it was actually something else entirely. The secret she needed more time to tell me was about a child, not ours. A child connected to her through the loss she had experienced at 27. The baby she had lost at 27 had been a girl. She had named her Clara. She had told me this on the 4th date and had not spoken of Clara again in the 14 years since, not because Clara was gone from her heart, but because she had learned, in the years between the loss and our marriage, that some things are carried rather than spoken, that some grief is private not by choice but by the specific nature of what was lost, which was a person who existed only in the space between being expected and not arriving. What she had not told me, on the 4th date or in the 14 years after, was that Clara had not been entirely without presence in the world, that before Clara, there had been a decision Miriam had made at 24, before Robert, before the loss, in a year of her life that she had described to me only in the vaguest terms as a difficult year after she moved to Nashville. The difficult year had included a pregnancy, an earlier pregnancy, before the one she had told me about. A pregnancy that had not ended in loss but in a decision made by a 24-year-old woman who was alone in a city where she knew no one, and who had concluded, in the specific, desperate arithmetic of that situation, that she could not be a parent to this child, and that the most loving thing available to her was to place the child for adoption with a family who could. She had made the adoption plan. She had signed the papers. She had never spoken of it to anyone except the social worker and the attorney, and later the therapist she had seen for 2 years in her late 20s. She had not told Robert. She had not told her parents. She had not told me. For 20 years, she had carried the specific weight of a person who has made the most consequential decision of their life, and who has protected that decision by not speaking of it. Not because the decision was wrong, but because speaking of it required explaining everything that led to it, and explaining everything that led to it required trusting the listener with a version of herself that was more vulnerable than the version she had learned to present. 20 years. And then, in August of the year I was sitting in the study with the divorce papers in the 3rd drawer, a letter had arrived. Not to the house, to her therapist's office, which had a standing forwarding arrangement for exactly this kind of communication, established years earlier through the adoption agency, when Miriam had indicated, in the paperwork that allowed for it, that she was open to contact when the child reached adulthood. The letter was from a young woman named Sophie. She was 20 years old. She was a junior at Vanderbilt University studying music therapy. She had grown up in Brentwood, Tennessee, which is 3 miles from where Miriam and I lived. She had been placed with a family named Holloway, who had raised her with full knowledge of her adoption, and who had, when Sophie expressed interest in finding her birth mother, supported her in the search with the specific, generous love of parents who understood that knowing where you come from does not diminish where you are. Sophie had found Miriam through the agency's mutual consent registry. She had written a letter that Miriam's therapist had forwarded in September. Miriam had been carrying the letter, unopened and then read again, for 3 months. She had not told me. She had been trying to figure out how. I know all of this not because I overheard another phone call, because on the Friday morning after the Thursday call, I went to Miriam and I sat across from her at the kitchen table and I said, I need to tell you something before you tell me something. And then I am going to need you to tell me the thing you have been trying to tell me. Because I think you have been trying for months and I have not made it easy and I am sorry for that and I am ready now. She looked at me. I said, I heard part of your call last night. Not on purpose. The wall is thin and I was in the study and I was not listening for anything but I heard. And I heard enough to know that you are carrying something that you believe I deserve to know, and that you have been protecting yourself by not telling me and that you are afraid. I said, I want you to know that I am not afraid. Whatever you are carrying, I want to carry it with you. Not because I am owed that role, because I love you and loving you means showing up for the things that are hard to say as well as the things that are easy. She was very still across the table. The kitchen was the specific, ordinary kitchen of a morning in November, light coming through the window above the sink, coffee going cold in the cups between us, the refrigerator running, the clock above the stove marking the distance between one moment and the next. She said, I need to tell you something that I should have told you before we married. I said, all right. She said, it is going to change things. I do not know how, but it is going to change things. I said, things have already changed. They have been changing for 4 months. I would rather they changed in the direction of honesty than continued changing in the direction of silence. She picked up her coffee cup. She held it in both hands. She looked at it the way people look at something when they need something to look at, while they organize themselves for what they are about to say. Then she told me. She told me about 24 and the difficult year, and the decision she had made and the adoption, and the 20 years of carrying it. She told me about Sophie's letter and the 3 months of reading it and rereading it and not knowing how to bring it to me, and being afraid of what the bringing would do to us. She cried through some of it. Not the contained crying I had heard through the wall. The complete crying of a person who has been holding something for 20 years and has finally found the person strong enough to hold it with them. I did not interrupt. I listened the way my father had taught me to listen, with the full attention of a person who understands that what is being said is the most important thing happening in the room, and that every other response is secondary to the listening itself. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. The clock ticked. The coffee was cold. The November light had shifted through the window above the sink as the morning moved forward, indifferent to the magnitude of what had been said in its presence. I said, "What does Sophie want?" She said in the letter that she is not looking for a mother. She has a mother. She said she is looking for context, for the story behind her beginning, for the person who made the decision she was made from and who she has always understood, from what her parents told her, made it out of love rather than abandonment. She said she would like to meet me, if I am willing. I said, "And are you?" She said, I do not know. I do not know if I am entitled to that. I do not know. I do not know if meeting her is something I have the right to want. I said, you did not give up the right to want things when you made a decision at 24 that a 24-year-old alone in a city should not have had to make by herself. You made the most loving decision available to you with the resources available to you, and you have carried it for 20 years, and you are still carrying it, and the carrying has cost you things that I should have been helping you carry years ago. She said, you did not know. I said, I know, and I want to talk about that. Not now. Later. I want to talk about why you did not tell me and whether I made it safe to tell me or whether I inadvertently made the walls higher and how we build something going forward that makes the hard things sayable before they have been carried for 20 years. She said, you are not angry. I said, I am not angry. I am heartbroken that you carried this alone. I am grateful that you told me, and I'm in love with my wife, who made the hardest decision of her life at 24, and who has been a person of extraordinary compassion and integrity every day since, and who has spent 16 years helping children who need specific and patient attention because she understands something about what children need that comes from the most personal possible place. She pressed her hand against her mouth. She looked at me over the hand. She said, I thought you would leave. I said I almost left for a completely different reason, and I was wrong about that reason, and I am not going to leave for this one. She said, what were you leaving for? I said, I thought the distance of the past 4 months was the marriage ending. I thought you were pulling away because we had stopped working. I had divorce papers in the third drawer of my desk. She went very still. She said, "Divorce papers." I said, "Drafted, not signed, not filed." I had been 4 days away from filing for 6 weeks. And last night I heard you on the phone and I heard you say that you were protecting yourself by not telling me something I deserved to know. And I made a decision to wait, to give you the time you said you needed, to not be the thing that forced the conversation before you were ready for it. She said you had divorce papers. I said yes. She said because of the distance. I said yes. She said the distance was because of Sophie's letter. I said yes. I understand that now. She said if you had filed. I said I did not file. She said, but if you had. I said I did not. And I am not going to. That is a decision I am making right now, at this table, with the full information, and I am making it without reservation. She looked at me across the kitchen table. She looked at the man she had been married to for 14 years, and who had been 4 days away from ending the marriage for 6 weeks and who had, on the basis of 30 seconds of an overheard phone call, decided to wait. She said, 30 seconds. I said, it was enough. She said, that is the thinnest possible margin. I said, the thinnest margins are the ones that matter the most. The easy ones do not require anything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what do we do now? I said, we decide together whether you want to meet Sophie, and we decide together how to do that in a way that is honest and careful, and that honors what she has said she is looking for, which is context, and the story behind her beginning. And we decide together what the story is and who tells it and how. She said, together. I said yes, together. That is the thing we have not been doing for 4 months and that I want us to do going forward. Together. With the hard things and the complicated things and the things that are difficult to say. Together. She said, I do not know how to be brave enough for all of this. I said, you were brave enough to tell me this morning. That is the beginning of the bravery. The rest follows from the beginning. She reached across the table. She took my hand. She held it in both of hers the way she had held her coffee cup, not casually, but with the specific, deliberate grip of a person holding something they do not intend to let go of. I held her hand back. Outside the kitchen window, the November morning continued. The light did what light does in November in Tennessee. Moved slowly and honestly across the surface of things without warmth but with clarity, showing everything exactly as it was. In the weeks that followed, we talked. We talked in a way we had not talked in years. Not the logistical conversations of a household managing itself, or the careful conversations of two people avoiding the things they were not saying, but the real conversations, the ones that go to the places where the important things live, and that require the participants to be willing to find out what is there, even when they are not sure they will like it. I told her about the papers. I told her everything about the 6 weeks and the 4 days away, and the decision I had almost made and the reasoning I had used to arrive at it. I told her because she deserved the complete picture, and because I had said we would do the hard things together, and this was one of them. She told me about Sophie's letter, not the summary of it, the actual letter. She brought it to the kitchen table and read it to me in full. All 5 handwritten pages of it, the voice of a 20-year-old young woman who had grown up knowing she was chosen and who was curious about the person who had done the choosing in the specific, gentle, non-demanding way of someone who has been raised with enough security to approach uncertainty without needing it to resolve into anything in particular. Sophie's letter was extraordinary, not because it was perfectly written. It was not. It had the specific, earnest imperfection of a person saying something important for the first time and not yet knowing the right words. It was extraordinary because of what it was not. It was not an accusation. It was not a demand. It was not a summons. It was a question, asked with the specific, patient openness of a person who has been taught that some questions do not have answers you can force and that the asking is its own form of answer. I said, she sounds like you. Miriam said, what do you mean? I said the way she asks for what she needs without demanding it, the way she makes room for the other person to respond at their own pace. That is a quality that comes from specific people. It does not just happen. Miriam was quiet. I said, "Whoever raised her did a beautiful job, and you gave her to people who could do that job when you could not yet do it yourself. That is not abandonment. That is the most accurate definition of love I have ever encountered." She cried. I held her. We sat in the kitchen for a long time. We decided together that Miriam would respond to Sophie's letter. Not immediately, with the specific careful deliberateness of two people who understood that the response would be the beginning of something, and that beginnings deserve to be thought through rather than rushed. Miriam wrote the response over 2 weeks. She wrote drafts and showed them to me, and we talked about what she was trying to say, and whether the words were saying it, and how to be honest about the complexity without overwhelming a 20-year-old who had asked a specific and limited question with a weight that was not hers to carry. The response she sent was 4 pages. It said what it needed to say and no more than that. It was, like Sophie's letter, imperfect in the specific, earnest way of someone saying something important for the first time. It was honest about the 24-year-old she had been and the decision she had made and the reasons behind it. It was honest about the 20 years since and what she had carried. It was honest about the husband she had now and the life she had built, and the ways in which the building of that life had been shaped, more than she had fully acknowledged even to herself, by the person she had not been able to keep. She did not send the letter without telling me what was in it. She showed me every page before she sent it. Not for my approval, for the shared understanding that we had agreed to build together. I read every page. I told her it was the truest thing I had ever read. I meant it. Sophie wrote back within a week. Her response was 2 pages and said, "I would like to meet you. And your husband, if he is willing. I think I would like to know where I come from in the fullest sense. My parents agree. They would like to meet you too if that is not too much. I know it might be too much. It is all right if it is." Miriam showed me the letter. She looked at me with the expression of a person who has just been offered something they were not sure they would be offered, and who does not yet know how to hold it. I said, "It is not too much." She said, "You want to meet her?" I said, "I want to meet the person who sent that letter. I want to meet the young woman who is studying music therapy at Vanderbilt 3 miles from our house, and I want to be at your side when you meet her because that is what I said I would do, and it is what I intend to do." She said, "You do not have to." I said, "I know. That is the point." We met Sophie on a Saturday in December at a coffee shop on Main Street in Franklin. Not a grand venue, not a planned event. A coffee shop with wooden tables and mismatched chairs in the specific warm, unpretentious atmosphere of a place that does not know it is being used for one of the most significant meetings of 3 people's lives. Sophie was 20 years old and had Miriam's eyes. Not metaphorically. The specific literal shape and color of them, a fact that arrived with the particular gentle force of a thing that simply is, that does not require interpretation or commentary, that exists in the room with the same patient indifference as the November light. Miriam saw it first. I watched her see it. I watched her face do what faces do when the world delivers information that the heart recognizes before the mind does. The specific, involuntary recognition of a connection so fundamental that it bypasses the rational entirely and lands in a place that rationality does not govern. Sophie saw it too. She looked at Miriam and then at me and then at Miriam again, and she said, "My mom said you might look like me." She was right. Miriam said, "Yes." Sophie said, "That is strange, right?" "It is strange, but also good. I am not sure which is more." Miriam said, "Both." "I think it is both." Sophie said, "My parents want me to say hello from them. They said they are grateful. They said they have always been grateful. They wanted me to tell you that specifically." Miriam's eyes filled. She held them the way I had learned over 14 years, was her specific quality, the ability to feel things completely and hold the composure around them simultaneously. She said, "I am grateful too. I have been grateful for 20 years that she went to people who would tell her that." Sophie looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up. She said, "Can I ask you something that might be hard to answer?" Miriam said, "Yes." Sophie said, "Was it the hardest thing you ever did?" Miriam said, "Yes." Sophie said, "Then I want you to know that it was the right thing. My parents are wonderful people, and my childhood was full and good, and I have never felt like anything was missing. I am here because I am curious, not because I am looking for something I did not have. I want you to know that." Miriam said, "That is one of the kindest things anyone has ever said to me." Sophie said, "It is true, and I believe that true things should be said." I said, "You sound like your mother." Both of them looked at me. Then they looked at each other. Then Sophie laughed. A real laugh, warm and easy. The laugh of a person who is comfortable enough in themselves to let unexpected things be funny. Miriam laughed too. And the laughing was the most beautiful sound in that coffee shop on that Saturday in December. The specific, unrepeatable sound of something that had been held in pain for 20 years finding, in a single moment, its way towards something different. We sat in the coffee shop for 2 hours. We talked about Sophie's music therapy program and her parents and the neighborhood in Brentwood where she had grown up, and the specific, ordinary details of a life that had been lived 3 miles from us without our knowing it. We talked about Miriam's work with children and how she had come to it and what it meant to her. We talked about things that were not heavy and things that were. When we left, Sophie hugged Miriam. Not a formal hug, a real one. The hug of a person choosing to be physically present with another person and meaning the presence. Sophie shook my hand. Then she said, "Actually, can I hug you too? Is that strange?" I said, "It is not strange." She hugged me. I hugged her back. She walked to her car. She turned once and waved. Then she was gone. Miriam and I stood on the sidewalk in the December cold. The Christmas decorations on Main Street were lit and the town had the specific seasonal warmth of a place that knows how to be beautiful in December and is making the most of it. She said, "I have been afraid of that for 20 years. I said, "I know." She said, "It was not what I was afraid of." I said, "Fear is almost never accurate about what it is afraid of. It is accurate about the fact of the thing but not the nature of it." She said, "I thought it would be grief." I said, "And?" She said it was, but it was also something else, something I do not have a word for. I said something like completion. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Yes." Like something that had been unfinished for 20 years, just became something finished. Not closed. Finished. There is a difference. I said, "Yes, there is." She said, "I should have told you years ago." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know. And I am sorry for not creating the space where the telling was possible. For building a marriage where the hardest things stayed behind closed doors because the opening felt too risky." She said, "You did not do that." I said, "I did not prevent it either. And not preventing and not doing are not the same thing. Being a safe person requires active work. It requires saying, I am here for the difficult things. Not just being generally present and assuming the presence is sufficient." She said, "You said it this morning." I said it on a Friday after 6 weeks of being 4 days away from filing divorce papers. I should have been saying it for years." She said, "We are saying it now." I said, "Yes, and now is where we are." She took my hand. We walked back to the car. The December air was cold and specific and honest in the way that December air in Tennessee tends to be, stripping away the softening of other seasons and showing everything at its actual temperature. I want to speak to you now. I want to speak carefully and honestly and without the kind of polish that makes things sound easier than they are. Because what I'm about to say is not easy, and making it sound easy would be a disservice to anyone who recognizes something in this story that belongs to their own. The divorce papers were in the 3rd drawer. That is the beginning of what I want you to hear. Not the secret, not the coffee shop, not Sophie's eyes or Miriam's laugh or the December sidewalk. The 3rd drawer. Because the 3rd drawer is where every marriage that has stopped talking keeps its endings. Not filed, not signed, not even consciously decided. Just present, available. The option that has been given enough form to be real without yet being real enough to be final. Most marriages have a third drawer. Not everyone knows it. Some people do not know it until they open it. Some people open it and close it again, repeatedly, over weeks or months or years, each opening a rehearsal for a decision that something keeps preventing them from making. What prevents the decision is different for different people. For some it is fear of what comes after. For some it is the specific, complicated love that survives even the worst seasons and that will not resolve itself into something simpler, no matter how much easier simpler would be. For some, it is a habit of patience built from years of understanding that the hardest things require the longest waiting. For me, it was 30 seconds of an overheard phone call through a thin wall. I want to be honest about how thin the margin was. 30 seconds. The specific accidental alignment of physics and timing and a wall that was built without adequate consideration for what it would need to contain. If I had been in a different room, if I had been wearing headphones, if Miriam had closed the bedroom door, if the call had lasted 30 seconds less. I am not going to follow the if statements to their conclusions because the if statements are not the point. The point is that the 30 seconds happened and that they contained enough truth to change the direction of everything. But here is what the 30 seconds actually did. They did not give me information I needed. They gave me a reason to wait, to choose patience over action, to say, something is happening here that I do not fully understand, and the most important thing I can do right now is not the thing I was 4 days away from doing. The waiting was the decision, not the waiting for the secret to be revealed, the waiting for my wife. The decision to be the kind of person who waits for the person they love to be ready, rather than forcing the readiness on a timeline that serves their own need for resolution. Psychologists call this differentiated love, the ability to remain present with a partner who is going through something difficult without fusing with the difficulty or distancing from it, to stay close without demanding that the closeness resolve the difficulty on your schedule, to love someone through a season they have not yet finished, rather than requiring them to finish it before you will continue loving them. It is harder than it sounds. It requires the specific active discipline of a person who has natural tendencies toward resolution and who must override those tendencies in service of another person's process. I am not by nature a patient person. I am the child of a history teacher who understood that the past is always moving toward the present and that the movement is not always slow. I like resolution. I like the completed thought. I like the fourth drawer where the filed papers go, not the third where the unfiled ones wait. But I waited. And the waiting produced the Friday morning kitchen table conversation. And the Friday morning kitchen table conversation produced everything after it. The second thing I want to say is about the secret itself, not about adoption, or about the specific circumstances of Miriam's 24-year-old year, or about Sophie, about the category of secret, the category of thing that a person carries for 20 years alone, because the carrying alone feels more manageable than the risk of setting it down in front of another person. These secrets exist in every life, not always the same kind, not always the same weight, but the category is universal. The thing that happened before, the decision that was made under circumstances that no longer exist, and that has been integrated into the self so completely that disclosing it requires disclosing the self, which is the riskiest possible disclosure because the self is the thing you cannot replace if the disclosure goes wrong. Miriam had been carrying her secret for 20 years because she had concluded, in the specific fearful arithmetic of a person who has been hurt by disclosure before, that the risk of telling was greater than the cost of carrying. And for most of those 20 years, the arithmetic held. The carrying was costly, but manageable. The secret stayed behind the wall. What changed was Sophie's letter. The letter made the carrying no longer sustainable because it introduced a reality that could not be maintained inside the wall. Sophie was 20 years old and studying music therapy at Vanderbilt 3 miles away. Reality had moved to within 3 miles of the wall, and the wall was no longer large enough to contain it. I do not think Miriam would have told me without the letter. She might have. She was building toward it clearly in the way that she said she needed more time and that she was afraid, and that she knew the difference between protecting herself and protecting me. She was moving toward the telling, but she might have needed more time than the timing allowed. The letter accelerated the timeline. The overheard call changed my response to the timeline. The marriage survived the intersection of those two events by the thinnest possible margin, and the margin was thin because of a wall and a phone call and 30 seconds of not having my headphones in. I do not know what the lesson of this is in the universal sense. I know what it is in the personal sense. The personal sense is that the things we carry alone, for whatever reason, honest reasons, self-protective reasons, reasons built from fear of exactly the kind of loss that carrying them might prevent, those things do not get lighter over time. They get heavier, and the heavier they get, the more of us they require to carry, until the carrying starts to look, from the outside, like distance, like pulling away, like the marriage ending when it is actually the weight of the carrying becoming visible through the effort of concealing it. The weight becomes the symptom. The symptom gets misread. The misreading produces its own distance. And two people who love each other end up standing on opposite sides of a wall that neither of them built on purpose. The wall my father, the history teacher, would have pointed at and said, "This is the invisible thread. This is the connection between what happened then and what is happening now. This is the reason the thing you are looking at looks the way it does." The thread was 20 years old. The wall was 4 months of distance. The divorce papers were the conclusion I had drawn from the visible evidence without the underlying structure. I was wrong, not irrationally. Based on what I knew, I was not wrong. Based on what I did not know, I was building a decision on incomplete information and calling it a conclusion. The third thing I want to say is about the marriage that came after the Friday morning. It was not the same marriage. I want to say that clearly because I think the instinct, when people hear a story like this one, is to conclude that the revelation and the reconciliation and the coffee shop and Sophie's eyes produced a return to what was before, a restoration, a recovery of the marriage that had existed before the 4 months of distance and the drafting of the papers. That is not what happened. What happened was the building of a new marriage inside the architecture of the old one. Not from scratch. From the foundation that 14 years had laid, which was real and strong and had held through seasons that had tested it genuinely, but new in the specific important sense that the new marriage had a different relationship with the hard things. The new marriage had the hard things inside it, explicitly, as a feature rather than a failure, as the evidence of two people who had decided that the walls between them were going to be thin, not because they lacked privacy, but because they had learned, at considerable cost, that thick walls between people who love each other are not protection. They are isolation. We did not become perfect communicators. We did not resolve the fundamental difference between a person who tends toward patience and a person who tends toward protection. We did not fix the things about ourselves that had contributed to the 4 months of silence and the third drawer. We named them. We made them visible. We brought them to the kitchen table the way we had brought Sophie's letter, not to resolve them in a single conversation, but to make them part of the shared conversation that the marriage was now committed to having. We continued meeting Sophie, not regularly or with any formal structure, the way people continue meeting who have discovered that they are connected and want to understand the connection without defining it. She came to dinner at our house in February. She brought her roommate, a young woman named Clara, which Miriam registered with the specific private quality that some coincidences produce, quietly and completely, and without requiring it to mean more than it meant. Sophie's parents, the Holloways, sent a card. Not a long card, 4 sentences. They said they were grateful. They said Sophie was thriving. They said they hoped we were well. They said they believed that love in all its forms was the thing that made the difference and that they had always understood Miriam's decision as an act of love and hoped she had always known that. Miriam read the card at the kitchen table. She read it 3 times. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "I have been waiting 20 years for someone to tell me that." I said, "Now someone has." She said, "Yes, now someone has." I want to say one more thing about the third drawer. The papers are still in the third drawer, not as a threat, not as an unresolved decision, as a fact that I have not erased, because erasing it would be dishonest about what the marriage has been through and dishonest about where the marriage would be if 30 seconds of an overheard phone call had gone differently. I keep them there because they remind me that marriage is a choice that is made not once, but continuously. Not in the dramatic moments of proposal and ceremony, but in the Thursday evenings when the house is quiet and the wall is thin and the person in the next room is carrying something alone, and the decision is whether to wait for them or to file. I kept waiting. I keep choosing to wait, not because the waiting is easy, or because the things on the other side of the wall are never frightening, because the person in the next room is the person I chose to be in this specific, imperfect, real, and continuing life with. And that choosing, renewed daily in the small and unglamorous ways that sustained choosing requires, is the most honest thing I know how to do. The papers are in the third drawer. The marriage is in the fourth. The one that holds the things that are finished in the sense that Miriam meant on the sidewalk in December. Not closed. Finished. Completed into something that was not there before. Something that has Sophie's eyes and Miriam's laugh and the specific, thin-walled vulnerability of two people who have decided to stop managing the sound and start listening to what is actually coming through. That is the marriage. That is what it looks like after the secret and the papers and the 30 seconds and the Friday morning kitchen table. Not perfect, not restored, real.